What is the philosophy of biology?
Strictly speaking, philosophy of biology is not new because it has been part of philosophy since Aristotle, 384 to 322 B. CE. However, recent thought about how living systems are different from the inert subject matter of physics and chemistry have resulted in new philosophies of biology as a distinct theoretical/philosophical subject. Moreover, social controversies, such as popular debates about creationism and evolution, and beliefs in individual self-determination versus genetic determinism, have injected new vitality into older issues in philosophy of biology.
What was Protagoras famous for?
Protagoras of Abdera in Thrace, c. 490 to 420 BCE, was the most acclaimed of all the sophists. Plato wrote that he was the first sophist to call himself a sophist. He trained young men for politics and was friends with the statesman Pericles, c. 495 to 429 BCE, who asked him to write a constitution for the new colony of Thurii. He was a productive writer, and his works included On Truth, On the Gods, and Anti-Logic, none of which have survived to this day. Protagoras was the author of the humanistic credo Man is the measure of all things. Of all things that they are, and of things that are not, that they are not. Protagoras held that the soul is nothing above or beyond a person's perceptions. His relativism was based on the different perceptual experiences of different individuals. For instance, what is cold to one person may seem warm to another. And he extended the relativism of individual experience to large groups in claiming that whatever is just to a city is just for that city so long as it seems so. However, although all perceptions and ideas of justice are true, according to Protagoras, he thought that some were better than others. He felt that it was the job of the sophist to change people's minds, so that they had better ideas about what was just and beautiful. The better perceptions and ideas were those that had better consequences. In other words, the sophists taught their clients how to succeed.
Which counter-enlightenment figures had lasting effects on philosophy?
Giovanni Battista, Giambattista, Vico, or Vigo, 1668 to 1744. Has in recent years been rediscovered, or discovered, as an important philosopher. Edmund Burke, 1729 to 1797, was the most explicit conservative of modern times. Although Joseph Marie de Maistre, 1753 to 1821, held similar views. Also, Jonathan Swift, 1667 to 1745, deserves mention as a mordant critic of the establishment in general. And the Marquis de Sade, 1740–1814, represents a kind of extreme marginality in his depravity, which marginality was later taken up by 19th and 20th century progressives. He also remains genuinely outrageous.
Why aren't there any women philosophers from ancient Greece and Rome who became well known?
The history of Western philosophy has been dominated by men for several reasons. 1. Until the 20th century, few women were systematically educated in ways that enabled the practice of philosophy. 2. Women's family and social roles did not afford them the leisure to practice philosophy. And 3. Male philosophers have traditionally seen the field as restricted to men and have sometimes gone to lengths to exclude women. Nevertheless, in every philosophical period some women have been associated with philosophy as practiced by men, and others have been philosophers in their own right. It cannot be known how much of the work of women philosophers has been ignored, forgotten, or never received the attention it deserved because, until the 20th century, little work by women philosophers was preserved or even mentioned as part of the tradition. The ancient period in Greece and Rome was a foundation for this general, male-dominated trend. Upper-class women were sequestered in special quarters in their homes and not educated for public life. Poor women were heavily burdened by motherhood, domestic drudgery, and agricultural work. Women with some leisure might sew, spin, weave, or listen to men converse, but always in their homes, whereas most philosophical interaction occurred in public places. Overall, women in ancient times rarely had the rights accorded to men. Nevertheless, the names and philosophical work of a small number of women philosophers in antiquity have survived.
What was F. H. Bradley like as a person?
Bradley was made a Fellow at Merton College, Oxford, in 1870. This was a lifetime position with no teaching duties, which only marriage could terminate. Bradley never married, and he lived on campus until he died. A kidney inflammation in 1871 left him careful of his health, and although he participated in the governance of the college, he avoided other social occasions. For instance, he turned down an opportunity to be a founder of the British Academy. Bradley detested cats and shot them on the college grounds, during the night. R.G. Collingwood, his neighbor for 16 years, later wrote, "Although I lived within a few hundred yards of him, I never to my knowledge set eyes on him."
What was Berkeley's critique of Newtonian science?
Berkeley did not think that we can have an idea of absolute motion. apart from particular things that move, or of absolute space, apart from specific distances. He thought that Newton's hypothesis of force and action at a distance might be useful for mathematical calculations, but that there were no grounds to posit it as a real entity.
Who was Émile Durkheim?
Émile Durkheim, 1858 to 1917, taught at the universities in Bordeaux and Paris, and is credited with having founded the academic field of sociology in France. His goal was to develop sociology as a positive science with its own subject matter. His major contribution in this regard was an insistence that society could not be reduced to the nature and behavior of the human individuals that constituted it. His principal works were The Division of Labor in Society, 1893, The Rules of Sociological Method, 1895, Suicide, 1897, and The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, 1912.
Who were the key players in the theories and practice of them in the scientific revolution?
Some of the key players of the scientific revolution were Nicolaus Copernicus, 1473-1543, Ptolemy, 90-168 c. E., who was not of this period, but highly relevant to it, Galileo Galilei, 1564-1642, Johannes Kepler, 1571-1630, Francis Bacon, 1561-1626, Robert Boyle, 1627-1691, and Isaac Newton, 1643-1727.
What is verificationism?
Verificationism is a theory of meaning. The meaning of a statement is its empirical methods of verification that ultimately yield sensory information. For contemporary verificationists such as Michael Dummett, 1925, this meant that the truth of sentences must be related to the ways in which they are or can be verified.
What were Edmund Burke's political background and beliefs?
Edmund Burke, 1729-1797, was a member of the British House of Commons from 1765 to 1794. In his early career, which was more literary than philosophical, he propounded a romantic view of art. As a statesman, he resisted political and social change based on ideals and abstract ideas. Although he supported political change that would re-establish proven rights or customs. For example, while he was opposed to the French Revolution for its ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity, he was in favor of the Irish movement for independence and the American Revolution.
What were the main original ideas that were important to Johann Gottlieb Fichte's philosophy?
Fichte was opposed to what he called dogmatism, or the idea that there was an external world that was independent of human beings and what they valued. He thought that atheism, materialism, and determinism were the results of such beliefs in objective reality. And this was to the detriment of morality. Even Immanuel Kant's 1724–1804 system had a dogmatic strain in his positing of things in themselves, which could not be known. Fichte's solution to these problems of dogmatism was idealism: mind creates everything.
What was so revolutionary about the scientific revolution?
What was revolutionary about the scientific revolution was how it emphasized objectivity and the need to look for natural causes for observable events. Many new inventions, such as telescopes, microscopes, thermometers, barometers, air pumps, and electric charge detectors, aided in this new endeavor. The principle of objectivity played out in public discovery, observation, and experimentation that could be duplicated for verification. To be accepted, however, important experiments required credible witnesses, usually men of substantial social status. The goal of exact measurement and descriptions that could be quantified made mathematics a permanent part of science. But the pre-Socratics had already sought naturalistic explanations for natural events and emphasized the importance of number, so those aspects of the scientific revolution were not new. The early modern methods of objectivity were innovative, nevertheless. As the 20th century historian and philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn (1922–1996) pointed out, the classical sciences of antiquity were astronomy, statics, bodies at rest or forces in equilibrium, and optics, which were all associated with mathematics and harmonics. So that advances in one led to advances in the others. In the 16th century, local motion, as something different from Aristotle's idea of motion as qualitative change, was added to the mathematical sciences. In the 17th century, the mathematical sciences were revised by the addition of analytic geometry and calculus. New quantitative laws of motion, new theories of vision, refraction, and color, and the extension of statics to pneumatics, studies of air, fluids, and gases. Still, Kuhn argued that Aristotle and the medievals also understood the importance of observation and experimentation. What was new was not so much the addition of new fields or striking new discoveries, but a change in perspective, new ways of looking at old things.
What was the emotivist theory of ethics?
According to the logical positivists, statements had meaning only if it could be said what would verify or falsify them. In terms of descriptions of sensory experience. Because both moral and aesthetic statements could not meet this test. They were considered not to have empirical meaning but to be expressive of how the person uttering them felt. So, to say, "This is right," would be equal to saying, "I like this." A.J. Ayer. 1910 to 1989, put forth this view in Language, Truth, and Logic, 1936. A more comprehensive account was given by Charles L. Stevenson, 1908 to 1979, in Ethics and Language, 1944. Stevenson argued that moral judgments do not have cognitive meaning, but rather emotive meaning. He meant that moral judgments are not factual in nature, but are rather emotional reactions to facts, which are sometimes meant to influence others. If the facts or other circumstances changed, so could the moral judgment.
What was Neoplatonism?
Neoplatonism was an elaborate system of religious and intellectual belief that was based on ideas about the One as the unseen source of all existence, as a powerful but unseen foundation for everything in existence. The One was similar to Plato's forms.
How did William Whewell think consilience, coherence, and predictions should be applied to test theories?
Scientific theories must withstand the tests of consilience, coherence, and prediction. Consilience refers to new kinds of cases confirming the theory. A theory's coherence is its ability to explain new kinds of facts. The theory's coherence ought to increase over time. Predictions should turn out to be accurate. Once they have withstood such tests, theories and basic scientific principles become necessary. It is a contradiction to deny them, given an understanding of their meaning.
What is hedonic calculus?
According to Jeremy Bentham, courses of action should be chosen based on their consequences in terms of the pleasure and pain experienced by all involved. Everyone counts for one, and no one counts for more than one. All pleasures are on the same level, and in Bentham's famous words, all quantity of pleasure being equal, pushpin is as good as poetry. Pushpin was a bowling-type game of the time. The value of justice reduces to its greater utility over injustice. Punishment, for example, is only just or unjust in terms of its consequences as a deterrent to future crime. Bentham's hedonic calculus consisted of literally quantifying pleasures and pains according to these factors. How near or far, how long-lasting, how intense. How likely to cause pleasure or pain of the same kind, and how many are affected?
Who was Karl Marx?
Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, was the German revolutionary and philosopher of modern society and economics who is most often credited with having founded communism and socialism as political movements and systems of thought. He is also credited with the impetus behind the modern labor union movement. Marx's early works are considered utopian and were not published in his lifetime. His magnum opus is Das Kapital, Capital, released in 1867, 1885, and 1894. Although the Communist Manifesto, 1848, that he wrote with Friedrich Engels. 1820 to 1895, is less hypothetical and more accessible to the reader. At the time Marx and Engels wrote, the following did not exist for workers in industrialized nations: minimum wage laws, healthcare insurance, pension plans, workplace safety regulations, laws against child labor, or specified hours for shifts or work weeks. Neither was there widespread and compulsory public education for the children of workers. While some of these goods do not universally exist at this time in industrialized nations and may not exist at all in parts of Asia, Africa, and South America, they are now generally taken for granted as fundamental human entitlements.
What has been Arnini's philosophical influence?
Nice, 1912, broadest influence has probably been from his overall sense that there are spiritual, if not religious, values in our proper connection with natural environments. People should respect and care for such environments as an elevated activity. Many contemporary environmentalists, theoretical and practical, share Nice's intuition that human beings benefit from contact with nature and animals in deeply nourishing ways that cannot be duplicated by commercial forms of entertainment, or even human interaction. Acknowledgement of such benefits has led virtue ethicists such as Thomas E. Hill, Jr., 1951, to claim that how we treat non-human beings both reveals our own character and partly constitutes it. In contemporary environmental debates, another way of stating the deep shallow ecological distinction is via instrumental and intrinsic values. A being has intrinsic value if it is good in and of itself, whereas its value is instrumental if its good is what it is good for. This theoretical point is important ethically in thought going back to Immanuel Kant, 1724-1804, which distinguishes between categorical or absolute imperatives and hypothetical or instrumental ones. But whereas Kant thought that the only thing with intrinsic value is the goodwill of a rational creature, a human being, some environmentalists have extended intrinsic value to all living beings.
Who was Frederick Douglass?
Many contemporary scholars of race consider Frederick Douglass, born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, 1818 to 1895, to be the first liberatory African American intellectual. In 1873, he was the vice presidential candidate when Victoria Woodhull was the first woman to run for U.S. president. Douglass began life as a slave, but was taught to read at the age of 12 by his owner's sister-in-law. He taught other slaves to read, and after a series of failed escapes he finally gained his freedom and became active in the Massachusetts anti-slavery movement. At 23 he began his distinguished and inspiring career of public speaking. He was present at the Seneca Falls Convention, where the American suffragist movement originated in 1848. Douglass toured Ireland and England in the mid-1840s, and his supporters raised money to legally purchase his freedom in 1856. Back in the United States, Douglass published newspapers, the most famous of which was the North Star, which had as the motto "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color, God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren." In the 1850s, Douglass spoke for school desegregation in New York. During the U.S. Civil War, he promoted the rights of blacks to fight for the Union. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1862, he said, "We were waiting and listening as for a bolt from the sky, we were watching, by the dim light of the stars for the dawn of a new day, we were longing for the answer to the agonizing prayers of centuries." In 1884, after his first wife had died, Douglass married Helen Pitts, a white suffragist from New York. Pitts had worked on Alpha, the 19th-century radical women's publication. While living in Washington, D.C., Douglass' main writings are a narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, 1845, The Heroic Slave, Autographs for Freedom, 1853. My Bondage and My Freedom, 1855, and Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, 1881, revised, 1892. He edited the North Star from 1847 to 1851, after which it became the Frederick Douglass paper.
How did environmental philosophy get started?
Popular environmentalism began in the 1960s and 1970s when marine biologist Rachel Carson, 1907 to 1964, traced the movement of toxic pesticides, specifically DDT, through the food chain in her classic book, Silent Spring, 1962. Intellectually, this led to a rediscovery of ecologist and forester Aldo Leopold's, 1887 to 1948, land ethic. A Sand County Almanac, 1949, and the thought of John Muir, 1838 to 1914, founder of the Sierra Club. Leopold had written, that land is a community is the basic concept of ecology. but that land is to be loved and respected is an extension of ethics. This moral tone set the basic philosophical orientation toward environmentalism as a moral/ethical matter. The Norwegian philosopher Arne 1912, was inspired by his encounter with the Himalayan Sherpas' reverence for their great mountains when his guides would not take him to sacred places. Nice developed an important distinction between deep ecology and shallow ecology.
Who was Ferdinand de Saussure?
Ferdinand de Saussure, 1857–1913, was a Swiss structuralist whose lectures were published by students after his death as Course in General Linguistics, 1916. A manuscript of his that was found in his house in 1996 emerged as Writings in General Linguistics, 2002. Saussure's most influential idea was that language can be understood as a formal system, apart from its actual production and understanding. As a formal system, the elements of language get their meanings from other elements. Apart from references to anything outside of language. This insight of the self-contained nature of language and other symbolic systems proved to be a foundation for what across many disciplines, philosophy included, developed as the linguistic turn.
Why wasn't Charles Peirce ever a professor of philosophy?
Peirce did have a job as lecturer in logic at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, from 1879 to 1891. But in 1883 he divorced Harriet Melusina Fay, to whom he had been married since 1862, and married Juliette Froissy. Froissy was thought to be a gypsy, and Peirce was said to have lived with her before their marriage. A scandal ensued, and Peirce left his academic position. Peirce's only subsequent employment was for the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey, which ended in 1901 due to congressional curtailment of funding. Peirce then did odd jobs and was employed as a consultant in chemical engineering. Sometimes, William James, 1842–1910, and other friends assisted him financially.
Who was William Hamilton?
William Hamilton, 1788–1856, was a professor at Scotland's University of Edinburgh. He is famous for his philosophy of the conditioned in Scottish common sense philosophy. He agreed with Immanuel Kant, 1724–1804, that we cannot know things in themselves. But also with Thomas Reid, 1710–1796, about naturalism. Reid's idea that we know things in the world directly and Kant's idea that we do not know things in themselves are contradictory. Hamilton believed that they could be mysteriously combined through intuition. John Stuart Mill, 1806–1873, in an examination of Sir William Hamilton's philosophy, 1865. Vigorously attacked Hamilton's notion that scientific principles are intuitively valid, rather than valid on account of their ability to provide causal explanations, as Mill thought.
What was mitigated or moderate skepticism as explained by Pierre Gassendi?
Pierre Gassendi, 1592–1655, argued that certainty or necessary truths could not be discovered in science. A necessary truth is a belief or statement that it would be logically self-contradictory to deny a necessary truth must be true. Gassendi argued that all we can know is how things appear, not how they are in themselves. In other words, we cannot know the hidden qualities of things. We have no way to reason from what we experience to what has caused our experience. If we have not experienced that cause. Thus, if we have experienced the effect of something, but not the cause itself, we have to admit that we do not know the cause. Nevertheless, we can develop some useful bodies of information about appearances. Especially if we augment that knowledge with atomism as a hypothesis. In Syntagma Philosophicum, Gassendi asks if there is any certain criterion to tell truth from falsehood. Clearly, some things are obvious, even to skeptics, such as the sun is shining. It is what is concealed from us that causes difficulty. For example, whether the total number of stars is an odd or even number. Things like that can never be known. But, there are other things that are not evident that we can know by signs. Our perception of sweat, for instance, is a sign that we have pores in our skin. There are also naturally non-evident things such as the hidden fire that causes the smoke we see that we know through indicative signs. While we do not know that the atomic world exists, we can infer it from indicative signs in the world we do perceive. Gassendi thought that it would be needlessly metaphysical to speculate about the property of atoms, such as claiming that they are mathematical. He also insisted that atomic explanations do not apply to the human soul, which he believed was indivisible and immortal, as held by church doctrine.
Who were the Sophists?
In the 5th and early 4th centuries B.C.E. in Greece, the Sophists were the solution to increasing litigiousness and education. If you can imagine a professional who is a cross between a lawyer and a self-help coach, that would be a good description of a sophist. The Sophists put on public exhibitions for pay to teach Greek citizens how to succeed in their public and civic lives. They were constantly on tour, and some became very famous. Intellectually, the Sophists were a cross between pragmatists, in the common sense use of this term, not the philosophical one, and relativists. In our day, a pragmatist is someone practical who is motivated by results, rather than highfalutin principles or abstract theories. And a relativist is someone who believes that there are no absolute truths or universal values, but simply what seems to be the case for individuals, and what they desire.
Is philosophy just the beliefs and theories of individual philosophers?
No, philosophy is a broad and messy subject. It can be divided into individual philosophers, subjects that two or more philosophers have emphasized, historical periods of time, and even places such as Greece, France, Germany, England, China, Africa, India, Latin America, and the United States. The chapters in this book take a chronological approach, identifying major themes within important time periods.
Who was Francisco Suarez?
Francisco Suarez, also called Dr. Eximius, 1548–1617, was a Spanish Jesuit theological philosopher. He taught mainly in Spain and Italy, at Salamanca, Rome, and Coimbra. He wrote on law, 1612, on the Trinity, 1606, and on the soul, 1612. His best-known work was his 54 arguments, or treatises, known as Metaphysical Disputations. 1597, which were believed to have influenced Descartes, Leibniz, and Grotius in the 17th century, and Schopenhauer in the 19th. Suarez treated metaphysics in the first extended systematic way in the European tradition after Aristotle, which was not an Aristotelian commentary.
What were Plato's main ideas as presented and developed in his early dialogues?
The early dialogues are very argumentative, and they display the Socratic method. Socrates is the main character, who begins by asking a question. Conclusions are not reached so much as questions are raised and clarified. The subject is morality, beginning with shared values such as piety or justice, and then demonstrating how little is really known about them. In the Meno, Socrates plies his questions toward the more positive end of showing how knowledge is innate in the soul. Meno is an uneducated slave boy from whom Socrates extracts knowledge of geometry through a series of skillful questions. Socrates concludes that because the soul acquired knowledge before birth, what we know is not learned, but recollected.
What did Bertrand Russell think about his use of logic?
Russell believed that logic could be used to solve both philosophical problems and everyday ones. If propositions were translated into the correct logical form. To accomplish this, he held the ideal of a logically correct language. For a while he thought that his student Ludwig Wittgenstein, 1889 to 1951, was on the right path toward supplying that. But Wittgenstein only alluded to such a language in his early work and abandoned the project later on.
What were John Dewey's main philosophical ideas?
Dewey brought ordinary life into philosophy. His main concept was experience, first for a cognitive Hegelian subject, and later as a more inclusive emotional and active dimension of human life. Dewey argued, against philosophical idealists and indeed most other philosophers of his day, that most of what is important in our experience is not reflective. Unlike the Hegelians, he also insisted that there was not a unified whole of all experience, but many interlocking versions or kinds of experience. Experience, for Dewey, was thus pluralistic. But the experience of the concrete human individual, or the real person, was the primary form of experience for Dewey. Dewey sought to articulate the anthropological and biological nature of lived human experience. He saw this as a new form of empiricism. Against criticism that he was neglecting what was objective in writing and speaking as though experience was everything, Dewey developed a metaphysical account of experience.
What have been the major trends in Latin American philosophy?
Many commentators identify four periods in the 500-year history of philosophy in Latin America: colonial, independentist, positivist, and contemporary. Overall, Latin American philosophers have been actively involved in political and social events in their countries. They have not, until very recently, incorporated indigenous worldviews into their intellectual perspectives. The colonial period, 1550 to 1750, was characterized by interest in medieval scholastic philosophy, such as the work of Thomas Aquinas, c. 1225 to 1274, and Francisco Suarez, 1548 to 1617. During this time, Mexico and Peru were important in intellectual life and the influence of Spain dominated. The Royal and Pontifical University of Mexico, founded in 1553, was where Alonso de la Vera Cruz, 1504 to 1584, Tomás de Mercado, 1530 to 1575, and Antonio Rubio, 1548 to 1615, flourished. Antonio Rubio's Mexican Logic, 1605, was a celebrated textbook on Aristotelian logic throughout Europe. Bartolomé de las Casas, 1474 to 1566, in defense of the Indians is still widely read. During the independentist philosophical period, 1750 to 1850, intellectual interest was focused on political issues. Although European rationalism, empiricism, and ethics were also taken up. The Positivist period, 1850 to 1910, embraced European positivism and had local social and political applications. It was assumed by many, after independence, that positivist philosophy, backed up by social science, would usher in order and progress. Juan Bautista Alberti, 1812 to 1884, in his Idea, 1842, sought to modify European positivism to the specific circumstances of Latin America.
What did Ralph Waldo Emerson mean by the oversoul?
Emerson's idea of the soul came to him from reading the Bhagavad Gita and commentaries on it. Nonetheless, his ideas bear a striking similarity to European Neoplatonic thought. Emerson wrote, "The supreme critic on the errors of the past and the present, and the only prophet of that which must be, is that great nature in which we rest, as the earth lies in the soft arms of the atmosphere. That unity, that oversoul, within which every man's particular being is contained and made one with all other. That common heart, of which all sincere conversation is the worship, to which all right action is submission, that overpowering reality which confutes our tricks and talents, and constrains every one to pass for what he is, and to speak from his character, and not from his tongue, and which evermore tends to pass into our thought and hand, and become wisdom, and virtue, and power, and beauty. We live in succession, in division, in parts, in particles. Meantime within man is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related, the Eternal One.
Who was Edmund Husserl?
Edmund Husserl, 1859 to 1938. Is recognized as the founder of phenomenology as a systematic method of philosophy. He also created an important and new perspective on logic and mathematics, which distinguished them from empirically discovered psychological rules of thought. Husserl's major works are Logical Investigations, 1900, The Idea of Phenomenology, 1907, and Ideas Pertaining to a Pure Phenomenology and to a Phenomenological Investigation, 1913.
What was Edmund Husserl's doctrine of intentionality?
Husserl thought that the same objectivity of intentional objects that mathematical symbols have holds for all sorts of other objects, as well, including objects of perception and categorical objects, such as causal connections, states of affairs, and relations. When we describe an object we have an intellectual intuition of it, or our intention is fulfilled. Although in terms of what we do not know, our intention of the object may be empty. At first, Husserl thought that what was given to us in consciousness was not the Kantian thing in itself. But he later claimed that in a manifold of appearances, the thing in itself can be given to consciousness, which is to say, known. This view was criticized as idealism because all objects for Husserl were objects of consciousness. Husserl later qualified his position by stating that the thing in itself given to consciousness was only given to consciousness as a complete object of consciousness, not as its own total reality. Basically, Husserl was claiming that everything we know, even if what we know is true, is nonetheless something like an idea in the mind, e.g., my cat is now sitting on my computer as I write this. That's a fact. But as something that I am consciously aware of, it is also something in my mind.
What was Alexius Meinung's theory of value?
Our emotions and desires have a cognitive ability to discern value. This does not mean that our emotions and desires can think, but that they tell us something about the world, often faster than our minds. Objects, those things intended by us, present themselves with value features. For instance, the smell of the apple directs me to eat it. It has the value of being good to eat. Or a sunset presents itself as beautiful. A property that does not reduce to facts about the refraction of light or the amount of pollution in the air. There are also value universals, such as the good, the beautiful, the agreeable, the desirable, and different kinds of the obligatory, the general category of our duties. Meinung distinguished between dignitatives that are associated with ideas of the good, and desideratives associated with ideas of duty.
Who were the New England Transcendentalists?
They are considered to be the American counterparts to European Romantics, who valued emotion as much or more than reason and stressed the importance of individual and private yearnings. The distinctively American form of Romanticism, as seen in the novels of Herman Melville, 1819–1891. The prose of Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803–1882, the poetry of Walt Whitman, 1819–1892, and the essays of Henry David Thoreau, 1817–1862, emphasized the condition of the solitary and courageous private person in nature. As well, there were distinctly philosophical transcendentalists, such as Amos Bronson Alcott, 1799–1888.
Was Montaigne the only skeptical philosopher to reason in this Pyrrhonic way?
No. Montaigne, 1533–1592, derived his views from Sextus Empiricus, 160 to 210 CE, who held that we could not even know whether we had knowledge in certain cases. By 1590, Sextus Empiricus, 150 to 210, Hypotoses had been published in Latin, Greek, and English. Pyrrhonic skepticism died out by the 3rd century CE. Desiderius Erasmus, 1466 to 1536, was a closer predecessor to Montaigne, who defended Catholicism based on faith in the Libro Arbitro. 1524, on the grounds that theological controversies were inconclusive. Martin Luther, 1483 to 1546, responded to Erasmus with a dogmatic claim about his subjective certainty about God, based on his own conscience, as well as Scripture.
Who was Al-Ghazali?
Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, 1058 to 1111, was a philosopher, theologian, jurist, and Sufi mystic. Born in the Middle Eastern region of Khorasan, or Khorasan, and educated in the intellectual center of Nishr, he became head of Nizamiyat, a seminary in Baghdad, where his teachings in law and theology were renowned. He sought certainty in knowledge, and when he could not find it in his academic studies, he resigned his academic post, left his family, and became a Sufi mystic. He wandered for a decade and, as the result of those experiences, returned to Nishapur to resume teaching. Al-Ghazali came to believe that truth can be found only as the result of God's grace. In Deliverance from Error, his spiritual autobiography, he related his futile quest for truth and certainty through both Islamic and Western intellectual traditions and concluded that sensory information and reason were just as lacking. His alternative to rational and sensory knowledge was a light which God Most High cast into my breast. The key to most knowledge. His attack on philosophical authorities as a guide to truth and certainty, particularly in the writings of Avicenna, 980-1037, culminated in the intentions of the philosophers. And in the incoherence of the philosophers he offered a detailed intellectual attack on the views of Plato and Aristotle, which was again directed against Avicenna.
Who was Nikos Poulantzas?
Nikos Poulantzas, 1936 to 1979, developed a nuanced Marxist analysis of social class in late capitalist systems. Building on Antonio Gramsci, 1891 to 1937, he argued that elements of the ruling class have made strategic alliances with oppressed classes and successfully secured their ongoing consent, such as with the American New Deal instituted by President Franklin Roosevelt. Poulantzas' major works include Political Power and Social Classes, 1968. Classes in Contemporary Capitalism, 1973, and State, Power, Socialism, 1978.
Who is Ruth Barkin Marcus?
Ruth Barkin Marcus, 1921, was educated at Yale, received a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1952, and was a founding chair of the philosophy department at the University of Illinois at Chicago. After working as a professor at Northwestern University, she was Halleck Professor of Philosophy at Yale University from 1973 to 1991. She worked in the formal subjects of quantification theory and modal logic, sometimes in disagreement with W. V. O'Quine, 1908 to 2000. One of her most striking achievements was an early formulation of the new causal theory of reference, made famous by Hilary Putnam, 1926, and Saul Kripke, 1940. The causal theory of reference held that words for things have a history from the first time someone used a specific word to stand for a specific object or idea. For example, we call apples apples because that word was the first at some time, in some specific place, to be used to name the fruit. As proponents of the causal theory of reference put it, apples were baptized apples. Marcus' groundbreaking journal articles are collected in Modalities, Philosophical Essays, 1993. She received the American Philosophical Association Quinn Prize for service to the profession in 2007.
Did Aristotle lack a sense of humor?
Aristotle's writing style is magisterial, but his surviving texts are uniformly sober and dry, despite their overall common sense. We can't know what he was like personally, although he was described as having been thin and bald, speaking with a lisp, and displaying a sardonic disposition. When he retired to Chalcis, in the wake of anti-Macedonian reactions in Athens after Alexander died, 325 BCE, he is said to have remarked that he did so lest the Athenians should sin twice against philosophy, a thinly veiled reference to the trial of Socrates.
How did Descartes solve his evil demon hypothesis?
René Descartes recounted everything that he could doubt: sensory information, the external world, his own thought processes, and the goodness of God, and noted that one thing he could not doubt was that he himself was doing the doubting. From this he concluded that he could not doubt that he existed, since someone or something must be doing the doubting. He wrote later about his famous cogito ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am. I noticed that while I was trying to think everything false, it must needs be that I, who was thinking this, was something. And observing that this truth, I am thinking, therefore I exist, was so solid and secure that the most extravagant suppositions of the skeptics could not overthrow it. I judged that I need not scruple to accept it as the first principle of the philosophy that I was seeking.
What was Immanuel Kant's proof of God's existence?
Kant rejected the ontological argument on the ground that existence is not a quality or characteristic of things. According to Kant, we cannot say that the sweater is red, wool, and it exists. He rejected the first cause argument as partly relying on the ontological argument. And he rejected the argument from design on the grounds that, at best, it proves only an architect or designer of the universe, and not a creator. Kant himself thought there was a moral proof for God's existence because the moral agent knows that he cannot achieve his goals on his own without God. The resulting belief in God becomes a matter of individual personal conviction. Not it is morally certain that there is a God, but I am morally certain that there is a God.
Who was Kurt Gödel?
Kurt Gödel, 1906 to 1978, is famous for his theorem about mathematical systems, which appeared in a 1931 article titled On Formally Undecidable Propositions in Principia Mathematica and Related Systems. Originally published in German in the 1931 volume of the journal Minutschrift für Mathematik, Monthly Journal of Mathematics. According to Gödel's theorem, every formal, mathematical or logical system is incomplete because there can always be a sentence expressing a truth that can't be proved in the system. To prove his theorem, Gödel invented a method for correlating formulas in logic with positive integers.
Are all philosophical feminists women?
By no means. A number of male philosophers have endeavored to both learn and support feminism and include feminist subjects in their own more traditional work. These men have published such books as Philosophical Explorations in Light of Feminism, 1992. Edited by Larry May and Robert Stryckwerda, Men Doing Feminism, 1998, edited by Tom Digby, and Michael A. Sloat's The Ethics of Care and Empathy, 2007. There were women's separatist social movements in the 1970s. But this has never been a viable option in academia. The radical feminist philosopher of religion Mary Daly, 1936, who taught at Boston College for 33 years, was forced to retire in 1999 for barring men from some of her classes. Daly was always on thin ice at this Jesuit institution, especially after the publication of her first book, The Church and the Second Sex, 1968. Daly's work is about how men have appropriated the roles and power of women in religion, particularly in Catholic ritual. Philosophical feminism has evinced strong support for lesbian feminism on the grounds that lesbians have been oppressed in society and that lesbians may recognize the personhood of women more easily than men. Nevertheless, Freedom of sexual preference entails that heterosexuality remains a respected preference. Just as freedom of choice in abortion has not led feminists to invalidate, on moral or political grounds, pregnancy and childbirth. On motherhood, for example, Sarah Ruddick's maternal thinking. Toward a Politics of Peace, 1990, shows how childcare develops distinctive ways of thinking. Although childbirth and rearing is not limited to heterosexual women, much of French feminist writing assumes strong male-female sexual differences.
What was Mary Estelle's contribution to early modern philosophy?
Mary Estelle, 1666–1731, used Descartes' ideas to criticize custom, insisting that tradition itself is not a sufficient justification for the subordinate position of married women. She wrote, that the custom of the world, has put women, generally speaking, into a state of subjection, is not denied, but the right can no more be proved from the fact than the predominancy of vice can justify it. This willingness to criticize custom in the service of an unpopular claim was an important intellectual innovation. Estelle was interested in the use of reason as an innate capacity of women. She argued that women could find their own religious salvation, intellectually as well as morally. The target of her argument was the prevailing practice of not offering women the same education as men. In her A Serious Proposal to the Ladies, 1694, she proposed a college for upper class women that would prepare them for intellectual activities and religious services. Her claim was that the faults attributed to women could be corrected through education.
What is known about Aristotle's life?
Aristotle of Stagira, 384–322 b. CE, also known as the Stagirite, was the son of Nicomachus, who was the Macedonian king Amyntas II's court physician. Aristotle's career was shaped by this relationship with his scientific father. When Aristotle was 17, he enrolled in Plato's academy in Athens. After Plato died in 347 BCE, and the academy's curriculum changed toward the mathematical and speculative interests of its new head. Speusippus, 407–339 BCE, Aristotle left for Assos, which was then under the leadership of Hermias, a former slave who rose to the position of ruler that his master had held. Aristotle married Hermias' niece, Pythias, in 345 BCE, and after Hermias died, he traveled to Lesbos. The island of Lesbos, in the northeastern Aegean Sea, had a great diversity of marine creatures and contemporary mammals, as well as many ancient fossils. Aristotle pursued his biological research on the taxonomy of living beings there. In 343 BCE, King Philip of Macedonia invited Aristotle to serve as tutor to his son, Alexander, who was to become Alexander the Great. In 335 BCE, Aristotle returned to Athens. He founded a school, the Lyceum, in a grove dedicated to Apollo Lycurgus outside of the city. At the Lyceum, Aristotle lectured and directed research. He also constructed and stocked the first great library in ancient times. The walkway under a colonnade, or peripatos, was the source of the name peripatetics that was given to the members of the Lyceum. After the death of his wife, Pythias, Aristotle lived with and had a son with her, Philus. Their son was named after Aristotle's father, Nicomachus, after whom he also named his work on ethics. When Alexander, now Alexander the Great, died in 325 BCE, Aristotle retired to Chalcis, where he lived for the remainder of his life.
What was Richard Rorty's view of truth?
Rorty, 1931 to 2007, criticized the idea that all we know are ideas that represent the world. Or representationalism. He also challenged the special intellectual role of philosophers. He thought that true is just an honorific term used within linguistic and knowledge communities to mean justified to the hilt. Rorty called this epistemological position liberal ironism because it rested on ideals of human freedom. He thought that commitment alone is adequate justification for belief. This view led Rorty into relativism.